Did you know that the White House burned down? That's right. On August 24th, 1814, British forces marched to Washington and burned down the White House and many other government buildings. President James Madison evacuated, spending the night in the house of Caleb Bentley, a Quaker who lived and worked in nearby Brookville, Maryland. The very popular fashion icon First Lady, Dolly Madison, was credited for saving many important archival objects from the flames, including the famous painting of George Washington called the Lansdowne Portrait. How's that for cool? A new nation is born. How did America deal with domestic and foreign policy as a newly developed nation? Throughout this video series, we will be looking at how early America often struggled as it expanded geographically and developed politically, economically, and socially. An example of geographic expansion is when America's borders were maintained or grew either through war or treaty. An example of political struggle is when policies are created that either restrict or increase the federal government's powers, states' powers, and citizens' rights. Economic struggles include when business and trade policies are restricted, economic opportunities are not equal, or established labor systems limit people's rights. Lastly, we'll be looking at social and cultural development, or how America struggled with inclusion and ensuring rights for all its citizens. This video will detail Section 1. Political and Economic Development. How did America deal with the debt from the Revolutionary War and new political parties? Section 2. Political and Economical Development. How did the newly founded American nation deal with other countries? Section 1. Political and Economic Development. How did America deal with the debt from the Revolutionary War and U.S. domestic policy despite intensely different political opinions? Once the federal government was established and the Constitution ratified, George Washington focused his attention on the national debt accrued from the American Revolution with the help of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. He tried to pay off the debt in 3 ways. First, he issued security bonds. These were loans promised to be paid with earned money through new taxes. The federal government used the money gained from the sale of bonds to pay off debts to individual states. Second, Washington also encouraged the creation of the Bank of the United States. This made a common currency, the dollar, throughout the 13 states and allowed the government to borrow money. Third, Washington and Hamilton set up a tariff. This enabled American producers to compete with foreign importers. Since taxed foreign products were more expensive, he hoped products made in the United States would be more attractive to U.S. buyers. He also taxed liquor. People responded to all 3 policies in very different ways. In fact, this led to the creation of 2 political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans. Why was the response so strong? In addition to taxing imports, taxes were also placed on distilled liquors or alcohol, namely whiskey. Some farmers used their excess grains to make alcohol. Since alcohol became more expensive, fewer people bought it, so farmers rebelled against the government and its new tax. The farmers attacked collectors and resisted payment. The government quickly created a militia of 13,000 soldiers to squash the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington himself led the troops to display the strength of the new government to the American citizens. The Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans differed on more than just taxes, though. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted a strong central government that would promote the interests of industry, manufacturing, and trade. They tended to be from the North and were often wealthy. Federalists favored the national bank and tariffs. Tariffs made the prices of their goods more competitive with imports and more likely to be bought. Alexander Hamilton explained his reasons for a strong central government by saying, "The powers contained in a constitution ought to be construed liberally, broadly applied, in the advancement of the public good." In other words, the federal government should be allowed to do what is necessary to help the country and its economy. This interpretation of the federal government's powers is called loose construction. The Democratic-Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, preferred to give states more power than the federal government. This interpretation is called strict construction, meaning that the federal government should only be able to do what is strictly outlined in the Constitution. Democratic-Republicans tended to favor farmers and agriculture over manufacturing. As Jefferson said, "Cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens." Democratic-Republicans tended to oppose the national bank and tariffs. They were mainly from the South, and Southerners had to import more goods since they didn't produce their own. Tariffs gave them two choices: pay more for imports or buy from the Northerners. Similar to the Revolutionary War, ordinary Americans were angry about being taxed. Who primarily benefited from either of those choices? The Northerners. Which taxed product provoked a rebellion during the early American period? Tea, coffee, whiskey, sugar. If you answered C, you are right. The tariffs put into place to help pay off the debt from the American Revolution included a tax on whiskey and other distilled liquors. This proved to be very unpopular and led to the Whiskey Rebellion. What were tariffs, and who did they help? A tax on imports, North. A tax on exports, North. A tax on imports, South. A tax on exports, South. That's right, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Of course, the industrial North liked the idea of imported goods being more expensive. Meanwhile, Southern states purchased more imported goods, so they disliked this tariff. Section 2. Political and Economic Development. How did the newly founded American nation deal with foreign affairs that polarized political opinions? Domestic policy was not the only thing that Americans disagreed on. As a new nation, they had to decide how to relate to other countries as well. Figuring out the best foreign policy turned out to be a tricky task. The first major challenge was France. The French had helped the Americans during their Revolution. Now they were beginning their own process of rebellion against their king. The French Revolution began in 1789. French citizens demanded a republic and the protection of their individual rights. Sound familiar? Many Americans wanted to support the French. But this got complicated when France and Britain went to war a few years later. Going to war to help France would mean starting another war with Britain. The last thing the newly formed American government wanted was to get involved in another war. So, President George Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, which stated that the U.S. would stay neutral and stay out of any European wars. Alexander Hamilton supported this approach because he wanted to improve relations with Britain again. But the policy was not popular with everyone. Jefferson and many Democratic Republicans thought the U.S. had a duty to support the French. The next challenge came when the British began taking American merchant ships and their cargo as they headed toward the West Indies. Britain's actions were stopped by signing Jay's Treaty in 1794, but most Americans thought it was too lenient on the British. Soon after, British and French ships began the practice of impressment. They would seize neutral American ships, take the cargo, and force the American sailors to serve as part of their navy. In fact, things got so bad that the U.S. almost went to war with France under President Adams. Since impressment created tension between France and the U.S., Adams sent agents to discuss the matter. However, French foreign ministers, referred to as X, Y, and Z, tried to demand a bribe and millions of dollars in a loan in order to even meet with U.S. agents. Americans were outraged that the French asked for payment to even speak with their leader. This event was known as the XYZ Affair, and as a result, many Americans demanded war. Adams managed to keep the peace, but he also failed to stop the impressment of American ships and sailors. To protect the U.S. and maintain neutrality, Jefferson drafted and pushed the Embargo Act through Congress in 1807. This law forbade trade with the world's countries without first securing a bond with the U.S. government for the privilege. While its intentions were good, the Embargo Act crippled the U.S. economy and especially hurt merchants in the northern states. Many merchants openly defied the law by smuggling in foreign exports. Congress had to direct local militias to enforce the Embargo Act. After 2 years of economic depression and failed enforcement, Jefferson replaced the Embargo Act with the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 3 days before leaving office. This law restricted trade with Britain and France rather than all countries. Its effects were no better than the first. Even though these acts had an adverse impact on the economy, they encouraged industrialization because United States citizens had to make or grow the goods they usually traded domestically. War did eventually come, but against Britain, not France. After years of impressment and British intervention on behalf of the Native Americans, many members of Congress pushed for war. They were known as the War Hawks and were led by John C. Calhoun from the South and Henry Clay from the West. Most Federalists opposed going to war for fear of alienating the British. But Congress sided with the War Hawks, and another war with Britain, the War of 1812, began. The war ended in 1814 with the Treaty of Ghent. As a result of the war, the U.S. gained substantial territory from the Creek Indians who fought with the British. The American people also had a new sense of identity and patriotism. After all, there's nothing like a common enemy to help unite people. Who said it? Who said it? Federalist or Democratic-Republican? Remember, Federalists favored a strong federal government, while Democratic-Republicans preferred states to have more say over new laws. I believe the states can best govern our home concerns, and the general government our foreign ones. That's right, it was a Democratic-Republican. Specifically, this is a quotation from Thomas Jefferson, showing how he believed in a limited federal government. Let's try it again. Who said it, Federalist or Democratic-Republican? The cutting off of trade with Great Britain deprives us of a supply necessary to us in peace and more necessary to us if we are to go to war. It gives a sudden and violent blow to our revenue, which cannot easily be repaired from other sources. That's right, it was a Federalist. Specifically, it was Alexander Hamilton discussing why good relations with Britain were so important. Let's try one last time. Who said it? The powers contained in a constitution ought to be construed liberally, broadly applied, in advancement of the public good. That's right, it was a Federalist. This was Alexander Hamilton explaining the loose interpretation of the federal government's powers. Today, the population of the United States is still debating intensely about political policy and what is right for America. Consider this. In what ways do domestic and foreign policy create disagreements among politicians and American citizens even today?